So I'm Mike Feuer. I'm the Los Angeles City Attorney. It is really wonderful to be able to assemble this group today for a very important discussion during National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. These conversations that we've been having, this is the third in a series of conversations with me on a variety of issues with some very key people. This one has a special meaning for our office because of our work on domestic violence issues, and we're going to be exploring how we should be broadening our perspectives on those issues as this conversation continues. I have a couple things I'd like to do at the beginning before we dive into questions, but as is the case with all our conversations, we'll have plenty of opportunity after about 40 minutes or so for members of the audience to ask questions of what is a very interesting panel from whom you'll be hearing in just a moment. The first thing I'd like to do, though, is to take just a moment to do something that's important to me. As many of you know, I have been out of town, and I am now here, and it's important for members of my staff in particular that we all take just another moment to remember a remarkable member of our team, Donna Edmiston, who passed away in a way that is very tragic for all of us to grapple with. Donna had been in charge of our domestic violence and family violence operation for a number of years. She was a member of our staff for 28 very significant years. I'll mention a couple of Donna's accomplishments for those who didn't know her. In addition to heading our family violence unit, Donna was instrumental in creating what was at the time a very innovative program to vertically prosecute domestic violence. Under a previous administration, she was a special assistant to the city attorney for children's issues and put together a series of very important new projects on issues like truancy and preventing child abuse. Donna came to serve on the Los Angeles County Child Death Review Team and the Interagency Council on Child Abuse and Neglect. All those accomplishments don't come close to doing justice to the kind of person that Donna was, the kind of leader that Donna was in our office. She had an incredible ability to combine passion and intellect on the one hand with warmth and a real authenticity on the other. She cared about the victims on whose behalf she was working so hard. She cared about her colleagues equally deeply, and she cared about public service and was an example for all of us. And it's very important, I think, that we recognize that Donna had an impact on all of us that is going to last for many, 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 many years to come. So thank you for indulging me on that. I think it was very important for me personally to say that since I couldn't be here for the celebration of her life last week. Now, let's dive into our discussion today. This is going to be an interesting conversation because I think it's going to turn on its head some members of this team here, some members of the listening audience's perspectives on what domestic violence is. Many victims of domestic violence don't come to our attention at all until it's too late. And part of this is a testament to how we talk about domestic violence altogether. Domestic violence isn't merely about what we would consider acts of physical violence. That's merely one aspect of how one person attempts to control the other. There are other tactics as well: intimidation, isolation, the regulation of what we would consider to be everyday behavior. Those things they're all designed to make the victim dependent on the perpetrator. This strategy, this pattern of abuse, is called coercive control. And it can include a number of fairly prosaic elements: telling a victim what she can wear or what she can eat, how to conduct her everyday life. Some things could be more sinister: tracking the victim's movements by camera or smart devices, controlling or monitoring the victim's finances, intimidating the victim through subtle threats, isolating the victim from her family and her friends. And a lot of these behaviors, we are now learning, have a lot to do with how society assigns gender roles and how we think of what it is, what's appropriate for men or for women. How, in many ways, our society, and certainly the societies around the world, continue to assign gender roles and to teach boys as they grow up about what are supposed to be attributes that will reflect how they conduct themselves that could go awry as kids grow up. The skilled abuser, we're learning, in these kinds of coercively controlling relationships, often will groom or brainwash a victim and use all kinds of what you would consider sometimes to be fairly traditional ways, if they were to identify in isolation, traditional ways of communicating, but taken together they have a big impact. I don't think so-and-so is really good for you. I just want to spend all my time with you. I don't want to live without you. Again, in isolation, we may have heard terms like this in relationships we've had. Taken together, other forms of coercive control, the victim can become quite dependent on the perpetrator. And until we broaden our definition of what domestic violence and domestic abuse really is, we're going to be leaving victims without the assistance they need, and we're going to be complicit in perpetuating what is a pattern of behavior that we can, if we put our minds to it, stop. We're behind the curve in the United States. In the UK, for example, there are laws now that criminalize coercive control. New York is looking at legislation like this. And this conversation is designed to help us raise awareness here in California about these issues. And we have a very esteemed panel to do that. I'd like to introduce them now. Debra Newell is to my immediate left. She's the founder of Ambrosia Home. It's a furnishings and interior design firm, and she's the mother of 4. She's somebody of whom you might have heard if you've read the the Dirty John series in the Times, LA Times, or seen the podcast, or if you've seen the scripted series on Bravo that depicts some of Debra's most difficult and challenging experiences in her life. She's decided to share her story to prevent other people from falling victim to the kinds of conduct with which she had to grapple. And so this is part of, I think, Debra, if I think it's fair to say for you, this is part of an ongoing effort to raise awareness among people in the community about issues that you were not fully aware of when it really mattered. Is that fair?
I had no idea.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about that in just a second. To Debra's, I should tell you, by the way, Debra experienced coercive control, as I tried to define it earlier. Her sister, Cindy Vickers, did too. Debra survived. Unfortunately, Debra's sister died at the hands of her estranged husband when she tried to leave the marriage. So Debra comes to this from extremely painful personal experience, and all of us here are very grateful that you're prepared to share your experiences with us today. Wendy Blanco, to Debra's immediate left, is the Director of Counseling and Trauma Recovery for Peace Over Violence, a frequent partner with our office and a very significant organization. Wendy, we're delighted to have you with us. She has a master's degree in social work and is a California certified domestic violence crisis response advocate. And she's dedicated her career to these issues. And then to her immediate left is a relatively new member of our staff who's already made a very meaningful impact in our office, having done so in the community for years. Pallavi Dhawan is the Director of Domestic Violence Policy for the City Attorney's Office. She has 13 years of prior experience prosecuting domestic violence cases in the LA County District Attorney's Office, and she's written and taught extensively on these issues. So, that's our panel. This is our topic. Let's dive in. Debra, let's start with you. When did you first realize that you were in what is really an abusive relationship?
Well, I think at the beginning he was studying me to such a degree that he knew what to ask, what to say, what to do, he was love bombing me.
So you used a term. I want to interrupt you if I could. He was love bombing you. What does that mean?
Basically saying everything right, doing everything right.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Some of the things that he would do is he would ask me questions about my business, and it wasn't really because he was interested. It's because he was using it against me at one point. And he would obviously tell me how beautiful I was and how wonderful, and that he wanted to spend every waking hour with me, along with just doted over me.
And so if one is listening to this, I'm sure there are people sitting here saying, well, being doted over isn't so bad. What made this doting cross a line for you?
It got to a point, you don't realize it in the beginning, but within time you realize he's isolating you from your friends and your family. He's almost brainwashing you. I felt like I'm a very intelligent woman and very successful. And the things that he was telling me, it was like, it made me question, because he was so good. He was a con man. That's what he'd spent his life doing, was conning people.
So let me ask you, Wendy, you're hearing some of this. Is this kind of so-called loving behavior common among abusers?
Yes, I think that, so just to kind of step back a little bit, I've been doing this work for about 17 years, and so one of the things that we see is, coercive control, and it's a way to gain power and control over the survivor. And so we do see this happening, and I think it's also encouraged by a lot of our social media or movies, for example, that romanticize, this sense of, this idea of love, and that love is almost like even against our consent, right? It's so much love, like how can you not be okay with the fact that they want to be with you all the time, and that they're, we see it with young girls saying like, they're jealous. It's because they love me so much and they can't contain that love. And so we see a lot of like different ways that even the music industry sort of encourages and perpetuates these messages that are really harmful and unhealthy for young girls, and even just as adults. Like I've had clients, and I've seen both sides. I've seen the survivor, and I've also worked with perpetrators. And something that I've heard is, well, no one ever really talked to me about what it meant to be in a healthy relationship. All I got were these messages from, even thinking about Latinx community, like novelas, telenovelas, soap operas, where it's this, like, again, this hyper-romanticized idea of a relationship. But all the stuff in between, what does it really mean to have healthy communication and to have an equal balance, equity in the relationship is sort of overlooked, which is really what a relationship is.
Well, how do we know that a healthy, loving relationship has now crossed a line into something that's more abusive? What would warning signs be, Wendy, of that?
Yeah, so we see a lot of, again, the manipulation. And when we're talking about
give an
isolation,
example of what manipulation you mean.
So like when we're thinking about isolation, it's not what we think of, like saying, well, I don't want you to hang out with this person. I mean, it can be, but it's almost like these subtle ways that it happens as well. It's like if this person is so aggressive and they pick fights with all the people that are in your life, then it's almost like you're apologizing for their behavior and their presence. And so the isolation starts to happen over time, where it's like, well, I don't want to inconvenience other people, or this person is so passionate or so aggressive that then I'm losing relationships along the way. So it becomes, isolation is more subtle than just saying like, I'm not allowing you to go be with your friends. And so we see that happening, and a lot of times, again, as human beings, we have this like gut instinct that something doesn't feel right. And again, our society helps us oppress that voice that says this is not okay, something's wrong. But then again, the romanticization of the violence or the jealousy, that it becomes problematic. And so we see that happening like over time. So initially it doesn't feel unhealthy, or it doesn't feel even like you don't feel bad about it. It's over time that it starts to happen. These relationships start to dwindle that you appreciate so much.
So Polly, talk to us about what coercive control means from your standpoint as an expert.
Yes. So what's tricky about coercive control is that it manifests in very subtle ways, at least at the outset. And what we're talking about in terms of the grooming and the brainwashing and the love bombing is really a strategic course of conduct that is meant to lay the groundwork for later, if necessary, physical abuse. And when I say if necessary, the best abuser, the one who can control his victim, will never have to raise his hand because he will have exerted control through these other means. And I'm using he because although we do have the same-sex relationship abuse, I'm mindful of that. A lot of what coercive control is rooted in stems from gender inequality and relies on traditional roles that are imposed on women in our society. And so coercive control at bottom is a strategic course of conduct. It's a pattern of behavior that is designed to isolate, intimidate, manipulate victims and subordinate them, ultimately stripping them of all of their agency. And what it looks like is, Debra can attest to this, is, you can only talk to such and such person. You can only wear this. If you don't cook this, then there will be consequences. Threats are involved, sometimes physical violence, but oftentimes it manifests in these more subtle but very sinister ways.
So, Debra, I want to explore this a little bit. And if I ask you to respond to a question that requires you to relive something that's too painful, please, let's not do that. I want you to be candid if you feel like it, but only if you're feeling it's discomfortable for you. So you've heard descriptions, general descriptions about what coercive control can be. But be fairly precise. How did John exert control over you?
Well, like she's saying, it starts slowly. At first you think, oh, this person's really in love with me. But then he would isolate me. I've always been very close to my children, and they've been part of my everyday of communication, so on. And he started saying, you need to cut them off. They're too dependent on you. Or my oldest daughter has taken over one of my businesses, and he would say, the only reason she wants the business is she wants your money.
How did you feel when he said those things to you?
Well, I know my kids, so I was not happy about it, but I would keep quiet, because he was so great at manipulating that I saw it, but I didn't quite know how to handle it.
And therefore he was succeeding in isolating you.
He was succeeding, yes, because I started seeing my kids in private. Luckily I worked. A lot of women don't work because these men try to control every part of their lives. But luckily when I went to work, I could go to lunch with my kids. I could spend, any time I wanted with them. But then again, the other things that he started doing is he started just having problems with my friends and not really wanting them around. He wanted to put cameras in the house. There's a whole series of things that happened prior, and again, that's control. He wanted
to put cameras in the house.
Cameras in the house.
So he could keep track of what you were doing?
Yes. Well, but the way he went about it, you wouldn't have known that. What happened was, we think that he had planned someone to break in, and when they broke in, I got scared. And so he said, let's put cameras in your home. At that point, that's when he also manipulated his way into staying with me because I didn't want to be alone. So they have these ways of creating situations that you don't realize at the time, but looking back in hindsight, obviously it was coercive control.
But let's talk about this a little bit. So to take your relationship with your kids as an example, he got you to the point where you weren't prepared to see your kids in public settings where he would know that you were interacting with them.
He threatened me. There were threats that if I saw one of my daughters, because she would stand up for me, she saw through him immediately, that he would throw her in the ocean. So I was looking at her safety at that point.
Well, how did your daughters, if you could respond on their behalf, how did they react when you were only surreptitiously seeing them?
It was hard on them because we were so close, and they were watching their mom all of a sudden be manipulated by this terrible man. So it was really hard on them.
In terms of being hard on somebody, I alluded earlier to the fact that your sister was also a victim of coercive control and ultimately was killed by her husband.
Yes.
Yeah, do you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. My sister, Gorgeous, got married on her 18th birthday to her high school sweetheart, and we saw her less and less, but she was not allowed to go to the beach and wear a bathing suit. She and I would work out at the gym, and he had to sit outside to make sure she didn't talk to men. But little by little, he was controlling her, and she seemed so miserable that we kept thinking, oh my gosh, he's ridiculous. We didn't realize what was happening to this degree. And then about, let's see, she finally left him. She saw my life. I was having a lot of freedom, having a great time, and I took her out to Palm Springs, and she had such a fabulous time. She came home and she left him. When she left him, nobody knew the severity of the words and the actions of the relationship because it was hush-hush 30 years ago. And so it was about 2-3 weeks after she'd left him, and she went home to pack up the house. They had sold the home, and her son had gone to preschool for the last day, so he was saying goodbye to everyone. And she was living with me at this point. And she was sitting there at her table, and he had threatened, and we didn't know this until after the fact of learning a lot of things, is he had been threatening that if she ever left him, he would kill her. And so there she was writing a check. I remember her writing a check, and he had gotten a gun, came in, shot her in the back of the head, and luckily she died instantly without any pain. And that's when we started opening up and trying to understand what had happened.
Let me explore an aspect of this that I found difficult to grapple with when I read your story. Your sister's husband was tried for murder.
Yes.
And your mom testified on his behalf.
She didn't necessarily, the podcast, it's not quite like that.
Okay.
My mom did love Billy, did not see any of the signs, because he acted so perfect around her. So she testified what she knew at the time, that he seemed like a great guy, that he seemed like a good husband. She had no idea of the abuse, the control that he had on her.
Okay. Wendy, let me ask you a question. Here in Debra's family, there's some shared history of the kind of trauma we're exploring today. Talk to us about that. Is that common?
I don't know that it's common necessarily within families. I mean, we do know that generational trauma exists, but it happens so often to many of us. 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6 men, that is reported. So I think it happens more often than we think. And so, yes, it's probably going to be in families. And I think what is really important is to think about like it being a larger issue. So if you think about coercive control, even starting as early as childhood, we see a lot of our survivors who have had childhood trauma, whether that be sexual abuse, whether it be physical abuse, but really the message is that their voice doesn't matter and their feelings don't matter and that consent is not important. So I'm not saying that this is what happened in Debra's situation. I would never try to speak for you. But I think that what we see with our survivors is that it is sort of it's complex trauma. It's not just one isolated situation, but it's a multitude of traumas that even start in childhood. A lot of our survivors, they'll say their first abuser was their father. And we know, again, abusers are not just men, it's both men and women. But I think that we start to see this pattern of behavior where our voice starts to be oppressed. So we see less and less of what we need. We start to oppress that gut feeling that tells us something's wrong. And so we see it happening as early as childhood. And now if you think about that, and then you think about adding another layer and thinking about people of color, that, people of color traditionally have been oppressed in many spaces. And so you think about how hard it would be for someone to then talk about their story or share it with other people, because you feel this need to sort of fix it, for this need that again, this societal message that if your marriage doesn't work, quote unquote, you didn't work hard enough at it. And so there's a lot of these layers of barriers that are embedded, and so it comes from childhood and some of the messages that we get told as children, that again, our voice doesn't matter.
I want to shift the conversation because of time a little bit. And Debra, I want to talk to you about the systems that you encountered. And then, Polly, I want to ask you some questions about those systems. So first, talk to us about your experience with law enforcement.
Well, I went to first of all, a lot of facts are missing in the podcast and the Bravo series. The one thing, my kids went and got a private investigator to really look into John. But then after that, once we realized who he was, I hired a forensic psychiatrist, somebody that watched, not a bodyguard, but a private investigator. I had a couple lawyers, where most people don't have the means to do everything that I was doing. I was fortunate enough to be able to do that. And the thing with the law is I went to 4 different police stations, and I said, I'm in fear for my life. I'm in fear of what this man's going to do. I had all the papers on me of who he was. I think there were 9 restraining orders that against him, amongst many other things. And they looked at me and they said, oh, just go home. It's probably just a spat, husband-wife spat. So nobody took me seriously.
This is in Orange County?
This is in Orange County, yes.
Yeah.
Laguna Beach, Irvine, Newport Beach, and then in Henderson.
So the absence of a physical injury was really determinative of those police stations. They didn't see anything, no bruises, nothing, and therefore they were skeptical of your claim.
Right, because they said that I don't have a mark. And one of the questions they asked, well, did he hit you? Well, no. Okay, then why are you here?
So let's go to the next step in the system. So you sought a divorce, you went to a judge. What was your experience with the judge?
I was turned down the restraining order from the judge because, again, he was lying, which that's all he knew, basically. And he had not shown up in court because he said he was 100% disabled. And so they threw it out of court and said, or dismissed it, which we had so much evidence it was ridiculous. So I couldn't get a restraining order.
So, Polly, let me ask you your assessment of this. So here, Debra is at police stations describing what you would consider, I think, kind of a classic instance of coercive control, and the absence of any physical signs of that control led one station after another to say, don't worry about it. Then a judge says, I'm not even going to get a restraining order here. What does that suggest to you about the need for systemic change, if anything?
Yeah, no, I want to say that I don't think that society as a whole cares about women as much as society as a whole could or should care about women. And I want to say, too, that violence is not just violence. Violence is about control. Now, part of this conversation necessitates a culture shift, a shift in language and how we talk about violence in the context of intimate partner relationships. Because what we're accustomed to seeing or hearing are the bruises or the marks without examining the underlying motivations that the abuser possesses, and that is to control and dominate the victim. Sometimes that's through violence, sometimes it's not. As a system, we are failing women. Women now are, now it's I think 4 women on average every day are murdered by an intimate partner. That number has risen recently. It's a global epidemic. We're not taking it seriously enough, and so we have to change not only the systems, which would involve education of law enforcement, of judicial officers, of lawyers, of the public, so that we can recognize these signs of abuse and understand that violence is not just about physical violence. But we also need to shift the way we value women and the way we prioritize women's rights, because intimate partner violence and coercive control in particular, when inflicted on women, is a human rights issue. And so we really need to start changing the way we talk about it.
So, Debra, let me ask, you had resources. You described the fact that you had the means to achieve help that others might not have.
Right.
Speak to our community here about what you've learned from your experience that people could do who don't have those means available to them. Do you have any suggestions for others who might be confronting coercive control but can't afford a private investigator, a lawyer, and so forth?
That's tough because I didn't get anywhere and I did have the means. At least what I learned through all of my experiences was I was educated on the mind of a psychopath, sociopath, narcissist, predator. But most people are stuck. I get emails a day, so many emails of women that they don't know what to do. And so a couple things that they can do is, and that we can do for others, is stay in contact with them. Don't let them be isolated. They need to be able to talk to you. Other people, I think, are so important in these lives of the people that are being, abused, mentally abused. Other things that are important, document anything you can. And if you live with them, that's a challenge. And if you have children with them, even a bigger challenge. I was lucky enough not to have that. But these women, a lot of them feel stuck. And so it's important to always be there for them. If there's a chance that they can get away, there's shelters out there. But a lot of them can't leave work. They need money. So it's a difficult situation for so many.
Well, Wendy, I think that Peace Over Violence offers some resources. Can you describe those a little bit?
Yes, so Peace Over Violence is a domestic violence agency as well as a sexual assault rape crisis center. So there is domestic violence agencies in every spa, every service area. And so I think we've made a lot of strides in terms of providing services at different points of entry. So actually we have probably like 4 to 5 different police stations where our advocates are doing domestic abuse response, and some of the detectives are here today that we partner with. We also are in schools, and we talk about a lot of like healthy education and prevention that is really important to start early. And then we also have direct services. We have counseling, because we know that sometimes people are not ready to make that step. And as a matter of fact, when they actually do separate, that's when they're like the highest risk of any violence. So we want to make sure that there's a space for people to just talk through things, talk about what are options, what can they do. There's victims of crime services that we help apply for relocation, for any income loss. We also provide case management services. So if someone is looking to relocate, our case managers will help them look at different options that they have, and not just shelters, but restraining orders, again, relocation funds that are available to survivors. So there's lots of things that you can do. And even on our hotline, Peace Over Violence has a website and a hotline. National Domestic Violence Hotline is available as well. And so that hotline will connect you to any agency that's in your area. And so there are ways to get connected, but more than anything, I think is, people sometimes are afraid, which makes sense.
Well, let's talk about not just fear, but how society reacts when people learn about these kinds of situations. Debra, it must have been really tough for you when the podcast airs, shows on TV, and you're getting communications blaming you for the choices you made, which goes to some of Pallavi's point about how our culture recognizes issues. How did you feel when that happened?
The first couple weeks, I thought, what is going on? I'm the good guy, he's the bad guy. And it wasn't until Laura Richards, I don't know if you know who she is, she's the one that passed the law in the UK. Anyway, she was talking about coercive control and what happened to me. And a light went on. And the one thing that she said, this could happen to anybody. And I realized at that point, I'm not going to let anyone get to me. I know who I am. I know what happened. And I think I'm a very strong person. And I thought to myself, I can deal with this. It's now about educating others about this.
But let's take a step back for a moment. When you were enduring this, and your daughters were saying, Mom, get with it, can't you see what's happening? And you continue to interact with them sort of surreptitiously, and you're what to do. Did you feel a sense of shame during this time at all about how you were
you
handling?
feel so much. You feel, the one thing that was so hard for me is I've always known who I was and felt good about who I was. During this time, you don't. And you feel as though everything you always believed is all of a sudden you're being brainwashed. You're in fear all the time. You're a different person.
So, Pallavi, before we take some questions from our audience, and it's almost time to do that, just we have such a limited period here. Debra referred to the change in law in the United Kingdom surrounding these issues. Can you elaborate for our group on what the law in the United Kingdom is right now regarding coercive control? And if you could, kind of concisely, grapple with what must have been the argument against that law, which was, among other things, well, this is too amorphous, it's too subtle, there's too much subjectivity in this, and absent some sign of physical abuse in its rawest sense, we risk punishing people for behavior that may never have occurred.
So what's interesting is if we think about the history of domestic violence as criminalized, it's fairly new. I mean, for the longest time, hitting your wife was not a crime, and
There was a rule of thumb.
right, correct. So the rule of thumb, you can hit your wife if the
stick is not wider than your thumb.
right, and so and I actually, what's interesting is that I still, to this day, am getting pushback from people, even legal professionals, people within the domestic violence community telling me it's too hard, don't bother. What's the point? You shouldn't even try because it's too hard. You can't change it. So the UK was the first of, or it was England first in 2015 that changed the law, followed by it was England and Wales, followed by Scotland, Ireland, and now New York has pending legislation, and they all take different approaches to criminalization of this pattern of behavior, which understandably is, yes, it's difficult to criminalize because we're not used to talking about it, and we're not used to thinking about it as domestic violence at all. What I find to be the most effective language is the language that construes the pattern of behavior, which we call coercive control, in terms of liberty deprivations. So, and New York does that rather well. And what I'll say about what I would like to do in California is to track the language that currently exists in the penal code, criminalizing false imprisonment, which is a crime when somebody restrains a person's physical liberty, when they're falsely imprisoning, that's the crime, a person's liberty. But liberty in that context has always been and consistently been defined as physical movement. So I think if we can broaden the language of liberty to include personal liberties, the liberties we all take for granted every day, like who we can talk to, what we can eat, what we can wear, all of the behaviors that in the coercive control setting manifest as restrictions on a person's autonomy, I think that is the way that I'm looking at criminalizing this behavior. So to avoid challenges of vagueness and overbreadth, there should be specific guidelines in the law, because these are not behaviors that would go unchallenged if they happen between strangers, but we look the other way because it's when it happens in the context of a relationship.
Let me ask just one last question before we have, and then I want our team to be ready to take questions from the audience for the next 15 minutes or so. So, Debra, if you can, go back to the time when you first met John. Knowing everything you know now, at what stage in that relationship, what would have triggered, if anything, you're saying there's a problem here?
The first date.
Why? Why?
Well, I didn't know red flags. I was raised in a generation where the guy comes to your door, greets you, you go out, you live happily ever after. Wrong. Anyway, on the first date, he ended up coming to my door. My daughter greeted him, and he came in, and what happened was we went to dinner, talked for 3-4 hours, came back. I was ready to say goodbye downstairs, and he wanted to come up. Within minutes, he's in my room on my bed, and that was the first red flag right there. I should have told him to leave. Well, I did tell him to leave, but he was very unhappy about that. Unfortunately, I think my background is I learned to forgive, and I gave him a second chance. And I should have never given him a second chance.
But hold on. So he was unhappy when he's in your room, and you're saying to leave.
Right.
Why did his unhappiness lead you to say, I guess it's okay for you to stay?
Oh, no, I told him to leave, and he did leave.
Yeah. So you at that point, you did do that, but the point is you wouldn't have had a second date after having had that conversation.
Exactly.
Got it. All right, audience, are there questions for any of our panelists? Our reporter has a question.
City Attorney, this question is actually for you. You sort of detailed about the things that your office is doing, the things that you're trying to do. What measures are in place that expedite those kinds of options for victims? So let's say somebody comes to you with a complaint of coercive behavior. What are some of the things that you are prepared to do for those people?
Okay, well, actually, before I respond, I can see Pallavi was eager to go to the mic, so I could see the motion. Let's turn to Pallavi first.
Well, so I think part of the problem is that people, even victims or survivors of this phenomenon, don't know what they're experiencing is abuse. And so we're not seeing a lot of that out. What will happen is the person, when they're the victim of a crime, will go to the police will take a report, and the report will land on the desk of one of the city attorneys, and then we'll process it through, we'll file it or we'll reject it. The problem with coercive control is that it's not even flagged as a crime because it doesn't exist anywhere on the books. So these particular manifestations of abuse are not noticed at the outset by law enforcement and even by victims who don't know. I would say many of them, and Debra included, don't have a word for what they're experiencing. And so part of what we're trying to do is raise that awareness so that we can educate victims to come forward, law enforcement to respond, and then lawyers to then take action accordingly.
May I follow up?
Of course.
Do you have any legislation that you're preparing to draft that would help?
So I'm going to intervene at that moment to say the legislative session in Sacramento commences in just a couple months. We'll be having conversations internally about whether we want to promote such a change in law.
Thank you.
All right, other questions? So I'll leave. Okay, and then we'll go back over here to this side as soon as this person is finished. Yes.
Okay, yes. How are you? Thank you for organizing all this, and I am interested in knowing how can you support the judges that are here in the city dealing with emotional abusers and try to give the mothers more custody than just the 50-50.
Okay.
Okay, so your question is about how to support the mothers who are experiencing emotional
Yes, but right now, like sometimes there's so many moms out there that are coming to court, getting in debt, right, for the divorce, and it turns out the divorce is just very administrative, and the dad, no matter what he did, is going away with 50-50 custody.
So if I may speak to that, so part of what we're trying to do in raising awareness is to collaborate with all of the stakeholders. So we're representing a criminal agency, which is entirely separate from the family law system. But having said that, if we're going to make real change, we have to talk to each other. And so what we're hopeful that we can start having these conversations with family law judges as well. And I don't know, I know the presiding judge of family court was maybe going to send somebody here. I don't know if there's anybody here. The presiding judge is retiring soon, but he and I have spoken about this very topic, and he supports reform in the law so that we don't have two different frameworks for talking about coercive control that conflict with each other, one in the criminal and one in the family code. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but please know that there is hope and that we are trying to make a change so that we can hear everyone's voices.
Let's go over here.
Hello, quick question. So you talked about some survivors going through domestic violence, having this be a generational abuse, something that they may have learned. They're younger, their fathers being abusers. Do you see the same pattern with the actual abusers? Can this be specific to that intimate relationship, or are the abusers also learning this behavior? And if not, is it broken after, any incidents they have with that intimate partner?
So Wendy, I'll ask you to answer the question, and then I'm going to ask Debra a question to follow up on this one.
Yeah, so that was a lot of questions, I think. So I'll break them down because I think it's really important to talk about that. They say that it takes 8 generations to kind of get rid of sort of that pattern if it isn't addressed, so just on its own. So what we're doing at Peace Over Violence is trying to really make a cultural shift and trying to really raise awareness about these patterns of behavior. So there is when we see like batterers that are specifically fit that criteria, batterers tend to just be abusive to their intimate partner. So there's something about that relationship, that intimacy, that sort of triggers that behavior. So this person is not necessarily abusive to other people, for the most part. I mean, we have we have exceptions, but I think that for the most part, we see the batterers being abusive just to that intimate partner, which is why it's difficult for people around them to understand. Why are you complaining about this person? They're so wonderful. They're so charismatic in other spaces. They could have really great careers, and no one would think that they're abusive. So it is something that's specific to the intimate relationship, and I think that the last question you talked about is, can it be broken? So there is a term now for like harm doers, right? So folks that are inflicting violence against others are known as harm doers, as we're calling them, just to be more trauma informed. But there is change available. Like there could be like change that happens when there is willingness and insight about that behavior. So if someone says, I'm really struggling with this, I notice that I have anger issues, they own their behavior and are accountable with that, and having their willingness to go through a program, change can happen. But there has to be those elements that are present.
So Debra, before we go to the next questioner, let me follow up on this. So I asked earlier in discussing the very difficult topic of your sister's death and your mother's reaction at trial, about some of the family background that you'd had, the shared family background. Much of the discussion we've had about abusers centers on the fact that there is a sometimes generational impact of abuse. But I inferred from what you were saying is that, and again, if this is too personal, please don't, let's not go there. But I inferred what you were saying, you don't have in your family any kind of a history of abuse, but rather you were describing growing up in a society where the mores were such that you just kind of assumed that all this behavior, the doting on you and the isolation and so on, was just par for the course. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I was raised with no abuse. I had an incredible dad. But we were taught to forgive, so I think we had more of an acceptance for certain behaviors that most don't.
I see. So if you did recognize that there were issues, but in recognizing those issues, you thought, okay, but this will pass, something will change, I'm going to let this go because the next time will be better?
No, not really.
Okay. No, please, go.
I believe that there was no abuse in our family.
No, I mean in terms of your relationship with John, that you,
With John,
you forgave incidents.
No, you can't get out. It's not that simple. You walk away and you put yourself in harm and you put your family in harm. So it's, once you're in it, you feel stuck.
What gave you the courage to get unstuck?
Well, I knew I didn't want to live the rest of my life this way, and I think the courage to get unstuck was, my daughter made a comment that I had to do it now. The longer I stayed in it, the worse it was going to get, basically. And also, when he was threatening for me not to see my kids are my world. And I couldn't bear living without my children.
Thank you. Next question. Is there another question from the audience? I thought there was. Well, I have another question, and if there's not one from our team here, let me ask the panel. We're living in the era of Me Too. There's seemingly heightened awareness of issues that especially women confront at home, in the workplace, in relationships. It does seem as though that discussion hasn't, that the domestic violence conversations haven't caught up with the Me Too conversation. Do you think that's true? And if you do, why is that?
I'll start.
It's for anybody.
So what's interesting about the Me Too movement is that a lot of the focus is on these assaults by strangers or people in higher positions of authority than the survivor, and they're not happening in a behind closed doors, in the sense that they're not happening in the context of a family. And what I think is happening with the lag in the domestic violence movement is that there are these old, outdated modes of thinking that center around the privacy of the family unit and that prevent people from excavating the abuse that happens inside of a family. And that sometimes, often, I should say, will translate into blaming the victim for not leaving. Because in the domestic violence coercive control context, we're talking about a pattern of behavior that repeats itself. And so versus the Me Too movement where somebody, and I'm generalizing here, but I think I have to, because it's really hard to grapple with this for me to understand why the domestic violence has lagged so far behind the Me Too movement. But I do think that people are inclined to blame victims for not leaving in the domestic violence setting and shifting the burden to the victim in a way that isn't happening with the Me Too movement.
So Debra, let me ask, do you want to say something? Go ahead.
I think one of the biggest issues is victims feel ashamed. because there isn't support. And because, again, victim blaming takes place today. And so I think they're afraid to share their stories.
Well, can I add to
Yeah.
just that it's the same thing we're talking about here, and I think this is a start. I do think the domestic violence movement is sort of like a step behind, but domestic violence and sexual assault go hand in hand. A lot of survivors of domestic violence are also sexual assault survivors, so I don't think it's isolated, but I think it's just what we're talking about. It's the awareness that there's no label, there's no like defining factor. Like right now, we're talking about coercive control. A lot of people don't know what that is and what that looks like in the context of a relationship. So I think there's a lot of work that we still need to do in terms of educating and preventing, so that the Generation Z is then, having these larger conversations in schools where it's not trivialized and it's not something that's sort of behind closed doors. It's something that we talk about openly, and there are services available for that, for both parties. So not just the survivor, but also those that are aggressors that want to make that change, and having an open door to have them like also get connected to services.
So let's conclude with this. Our office, as was mentioned, has really elevated the significance of grappling with family violence. And one of the really heroic aspects, Debra, of your presence today is that you're personifying why this matters so much. Let's talk about that personal experience. You went through this now very well publicized, but very challenging experience with a lot of trauma. Have you healed from that?
Most definitely. In fact, it's made me stronger and more aware.
What tools did you use to overcome what was really significant trauma? And by the way, I'm wondering if your kids have healed from this.
Well, I had to educate myself what happened. What is coercive control? What are red flags? What is love bombing? What is gaslighting? So on and so forth. So again, really learning about all the different things that I had gone through are important. My daughter, Tara, has PTSD from the incident with John, and some days she's great, some days she struggles with it. So there's, we're still growing and learning and healing.
We're grateful that you've shared very courageously your experience with us. Wendy, your expertise is phenomenal. We very much benefit from our partnership with you, and we learned a lot today. Pallavi, your leadership is exceptional, and you're bringing a great deal to not only our office, but to the wider community. I want to thank everybody here for coming today. I think we're going to conclude for this afternoon with a lot more to come on this very important issue. Thank you all.